Hello, I'm Mary Monroe, and I'm talking today about Dora Metcalf, who was born Dora Green, who was my great aunt, and she was a tech entrepreneur and a founder of the information services industry. I just want to begin with a little bit of background. Dora was born in India to Irish parents, but the family came back to England when her father died of cholera when she was 8. They settled in Bedford, and Dora went to Bedford High School, which was a very progressive school and had been sending girls to university since the 1880s, as you can see in the image on the right. Dora gained her BA in mathematics via an external degree with London University, which again was a progressive university pioneering women's education and distance learning. So Dora studied from school to earn her degree and achieved that at the age of 19. She went on a fairly traditional path to teach at Allenswood Academy, a prestigious school which had produced alumni such as the Lloyd George girls and Eleanor Roosevelt. I just want to sow the seed in your mind that Dora's story is typical of the heroine's journey. So whereas the hero's journey has a lone protagonist who fights off all the evil to achieve his goal alone, the heroine's journey is a much more collegiate affair, relying on a network of friends and family as supporters and inspiration. So Dora gave up teaching at the outbreak of World War I, and she fell in love with this handsome chap, Hugh Cass, and they soon became engaged. But tragically, Hugh was killed at Gallipoli in 1915, along with so many others, and he took with him Dora's expected future. She was in good company. She was one of 2 million so-called surplus women who were often vilified and regarded as an embarrassment, and some of them were even deported, as if it was somehow their fault that their loved ones had been slaughtered. Dora threw herself into work and applied her mathematical skills to comptometers, which was a kind of mechanical abacus, working in munitions factories and soon training other women in between dodging Zeppelin raids. This is a comptometer that was in use at the time. You can see it's got quite an ergonomic design for the right-handed comptometer operator. And it was very much part of the whole office mechanization revolution, along with typewriters and telephones. All of these were regarded as women's work, low status, and really not part of business. And that was often emphasized by putting the women in separate rooms, typing pools, machine operator rooms, and such like. However, this was a good time for a woman to start a business. The men were all away at war, and this machine office equipment was seen as women's work and beneath the notice of male entrepreneurs. Dora moved to Belfast and she stayed with old family friends, Sir George Clark and his wife, and he'd founded the Workman Clark shipyard and was a great supporter and mentor for Dora. And she used her combination of mathematical skills and the entrepreneurial vision to see how these new machines could really change and improve the way the industry was conducted and the management in business and in government circles. And she found herself in the elite social circle, not just in Belfast, but also in Dublin. And in 1917, she opened an office in Dublin, and she lodged with a woman called Matilda Knowles, who was a renowned botanist and member of the revolutionary set. And it was at her apartment that Dora mixed with these people, including pioneering women doctors such as Dr. Kathleen Lynn and Dr. Catherine Maguire. Now, she was just selling comptometers at this stage on commission, but she founded her own business in 1924, and she called it Calculating and Statistical Services. If you remember, her lost fiance was called Hugh Cass, so I don't think there's a coincidence in the name there. She set up in business then because she wanted to win the contract for the Northern Ireland census. which had been delayed due to the troubles in Ireland. But she knew that she needed male collaborators. A woman on her own in a small business was not going to be winning a contract like that. For political support, she chose Sam Horton, who she'd met at Matilda's flat. And he wasn't just a good businessman, he was an Orangeman and a unionist, along with everyone else in the political scene in Northern Ireland. For technical support, she turned to her cousin, Everard Green, who'd been a co-founder of British Tabulating Machines. And he had brought these machines over from the United States that had been invented by Herman Hollerith. And he'd used these tabulators to win the contract for the British census of 1911. So between these two men, she had the support that she needed to make a success of this new venture. And they duly won the contract. And this was the first time that Ireland had seen machine analysis of the census. And the registrar recorded that all the card punching was carried out by 7 young women and their supervisor. In other words, Dora and her crew. It was a great start to the business. This was a fantastic advertisement of her capabilities. And from there, she was able to build an information services business. And remember that up to this time, mechanical calculation was just a swap for calculation by hand. Instead of having armies of clerks totting up figures, you had a smaller army of women totting up figures on machines. But Dora saw greater opportunities and wider application for these machines. And she now had both the tabulators and the comptometers to help her to create an entirely new industry. She got a lot of big contracts. She'd already been working with Harland and Wolff since 1918, and she got contracts with the Southern Railways and the Shannon Hydroelectric Scheme in the new Irish Free State. Her business really went international when she won the contract to run the Irish Hospitals sweepstake. So just to orientate you to these pictures, on the right we have a typical sweepstake draw event, and they were big events. Those are just women in nurses' uniforms. They are not nurses, but it was all part of the advertising. On the left, I've just circled a couple of figures. In the second row is Joe McGrath, and in the back row is Robert Barton. Joe McGrath was the Irish Sweep founder. He was a revolutionary. He had been jailed after the Easter Rising, and for a while he'd been the intelligence director for Sinn Féin and was involved in all sorts of dodgy dealings, including bank robberies, murder, torture, you name it. But this business was legal and approved by the government. And I think Dora probably had met him long since, probably via her cousin-in-law, Robert Barton. They obviously knew each other, and they probably met at Matilda's flat. But she had also worked with Joe McGrath on the Shannon Hydroelectric Scheme. And I think this shows her ability to retain a neutral stance. She was working both with staunch unionists in the north of Ireland and with Republicans in the Free State. The Irish Sweep made her business international, not least because a lot of the tickets were sold in Britain, but she also was asked to set up a sweepstake for the Roman international charities, and that led her to a meeting with Pope Pius XI in 1933. She moved to London in 1932 because, as I mentioned, the Irish Sweep sold a lot of tickets in Britain, and it was the biggest contract she had. And there she joined the Women's Provisional Club, which again was a very fertile soil for her to plant herself in this new London environment. The Women's Provisional Club had been founded by Ethel Wood, who was an advertising agency director, and its first chair was Viscountess Rhondda, who was a suffragist and women's rights campaigner. And it was a great place, not just for support and inspiration, but also for powerful contacts across the range of British society. In 1934, Dora formally joined the BTM staff. She still ran her Irish businesses, but she now founded the Service Bureau division, which again gave her free rein to spread her wings in terms of the mathematical application of these calculating machines. And she did a huge range of work and employed not just machine operators, but mathematicians and statisticians as well. And she was really developing the science of business planning and control across the whole range of the British industry and government. And she had her own dedicated government department because she was working with so many different ministries and local government as well. And that's important when we come to her Second World War history. She had 120 staff by World War II. And just to remind you that at this time, the term computer meant the women operator rather than the machine. But I think it indicates how mechanical these women were regarded as. They weren't really seen as part of the regular staff. They were below even the clerical grades. So when we come to the Second World War, BTM famously built the bomb machines for Turing and Welshman at Bletchley Park. And they were based on Harold Keene's design. He was the chief engineer for BTM, and he designed the rolling total tabulator, which had this diagonal plug board, which was famously part of the more successful bomb machines. The first one arrived at Bletchley Park in 1940, and they made 211 in all. And remember as well that Bletchley Park was the cradle of the electronic computer, as well as the brilliant mathematicians there. Tommy Flowers of the Post Office was also involved. And so there was a great meeting of minds that led to the development of the electronic computer. But back to the bombs, it was an immense challenge for BTM on all levels. They had to give up a lot of business opportunities in order to serve this government contract. They weren't allowed to apply for patents. They had to build a whole new factory to build the bombs. They were obliged to change the specification at fairly regular intervals. They had great difficulty sourcing raw materials and special parts, particularly as they were in competition with the Air Ministry for tank production, with other parts of the Admiralty for ship production, and you name it. It was a labour challenge as well. All the factory staff had to sign the Official Secrets Act. They had to introduce a 7-day working week, which had never been done before, and just recruiting enough staff to service the factory was a challenge, given that most men were being called up and there was a shortage of labour generally. And then even assume that they could manage all of that, you had to find accommodation for the staff, transport them between the accommodation and the factory, and feed them. Now, I don't know exactly what Dora did for BTM during the war because there's no documentary evidence and it was all top secret. However, I think she was probably the glue between all of these different working parts. She was the head of the Service Bureau division, and Bletchley Park was known internally as Bureau B. She had all the government ministry contacts, the relevant business contacts, the experience, the dedicated office in order to be able to manage this project. She also had the determination and the discretion that were required. We know that from her Irish history that she knew to keep her mouth shut, and we know that she was an incredibly determined and lady who wouldn't take no for an answer. Post-war, Dora continued to pioneer. She, with her old friends at St Altan's Hospital, supported Dorothy Price with her BCG campaign in providing all of the statistical analysis for that to show the success of the vaccination program. And Dora was also instrumental in selling the first electronic computer into Ireland to the Irish Sugar Company in 1957. BTM's model at that time was called the HEC 1201 and cost the princely sum of £33,000, for which you got 20 bytes of memory. So there's a thing. And I'd just like to acknowledge the fact that Gordon Clark was the very first computing engineer in Ireland, one of Dora's crew. And Christine Willies, another of Dora's employees and a mathematician, wrote the very first program for Irish Sugar. Not long after that, Dora retired, and her legacy, I think, has been obscured by two factors. One was that women really disappeared out of computing in the 60s and 70s, forced out by men realizing that computing was now an important part of business and a career option, and that it was not just something kind of separate that was beneath business. So that took women out of computing, and there was very much a focus on hardware at the time in terms of seeing computers as data processors, and the emphasis was on reducing cost and increasing the speed, rather than thinking of them as mathematical instruments, which had really been Dora's unique contribution. So that's why this is probably the first you've heard of her. If you'd like to know more about her, you can go to the website dorapower.co.uk, where there's a lot more detail on her background. Many thanks for your attention.